Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us today and joining today's Rocky Watch on criminal justice reform. It's an important topic. There's a lot to discuss, so I won't take any more of your time than to say that you can ask your questions at any time through the chat and Q&A buttons. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you the director of the Rockefeller Center, Jason Barabas.
Hi, Joanne. Thank you. This is an important Rocky Watch event. We've heard already this semester from current Dartmouth students involved in protests around the country related to the Black Lives Matter movement. 1 week from today, we're going to hear more from a former Dartmouth student, Keith Boykin, an '87 graduate of the college, about his own experiences in New York City, as captured in the Alumni magazine recently, and the protest movements and his arrest following that, as well as his new outlines of his new book coming out about race and politics in America. And today we're going to hear from 3 social scientists who are studying race, policing, criminal justice, and politics in the United States, especially their deep data dives and research into these important policing practices and policies. We don't have much time since we only have an hour, and I want to allow time for audience input. So let me provide some brief introductions of the panelists. Dr. Frank Baumgartner, who I think is going to be joining us soon. We're attempting to patch him in now. He's the Richard J. Richardson Distinguished Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's written more than a dozen articles and books and at least as many pieces on public policy, framing, agenda setting, policy change, and lobbying both in the United States as well as abroad. His recent focus has been on criminal justice, the death penalty, and racial disparities in traffic outcomes, including a 2018 book titled Suspect Citizens from the Cambridge University Press. This book won the award from the Law and Courts section of the American Political Science Association. Our next panelist is Dr. Andra Gillespie. She's an associate professor of political science and the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for Race and the Study of Race and Difference at Emory University. Her research focuses on political leadership, especially in the post-civil rights generation. She's authored or edited 3 books entitled Who's Black Politics? Cases in Post-Racial Black Leadership, The New Black Politician, Cory Booker, Newark and Post-Racial America, as well as most recently in 2019, a book titled Race in the Obama Administration, Substance, Symbols, and Hope. With many more articles, op-eds, and media appearances as well, including awards from the National Science Foundation and the American Political Science Association. Finally, our last panelist is going to be Phillip Atiba Goff. He's the co-founder and CEO of the Center for Policing Equity. He's also a professor of African American Studies and Psychology at Yale University. He's done extensive research on race, policing, and crime. His organization hosts one of the world's largest collections of policing behavioral data, which he uses as a tool to reduce burdensome and inequitable policing policies through scientific analyses. He was also a member of President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. I should also add he's an active Twitter contributor with over 50,000 followers, and I noticed a tweet he put out in June to urge people to take statistics courses seriously, and as somebody who teaches statistics courses, I was very heartened to see that on social media. Our moderator today is going to be Dr. Herschel Nachlass. He's a research assistant professor in the Department of Government and also policy fellow at the Rockefeller Center. He teaches and studies American politics and public law, focusing on institutions, health, and social policy. He has extensive interest in the policymaking capacity of political institutions, especially on how regulatory bodies evolve over time, and he has special attention to public health, the provision of mental care, and also the opioid epidemic. So with that, I'm going to turn the stage over to Herschel and our panelists in particular. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason and Joanne. And I will be even more brief. So for everyone, our format is as follows. Each of our speakers will take 7 or 8 minutes in sequence and tell us about their research on these subjects. I'm going to just go in alphabetical order by first name. So we'll start with Andra, and then go to Frank, and then go to Phillip. After our 3 panelists present, we'll give each some time to respond to what the other 2 has said. And then we'll turn it over to Q&A, which I'll be taking as we go, and ask people to volunteer their questions when we get there. So without further ado, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion.
I hadn't unmuted there. Thank you very much, Herschel, for that introduction. And thank you, Jason, for your introduction. And I want to thank the Rockefeller Center broadly for the invitation. So thank you, Joanne, for everything that you've done to help put this together. I must confess that as a scholar of campaigns and elections, I kind of feel out of place on this panel. So probably it's appropriate that I go first. But elections have consequences, and they have consequences for policies. So I hope to weave that into my discussion today. So I'm going to focus my comments on my most recent book entitled Race in the Obama Administration, which came out last year. So when I first got the idea to write this book, I thought about titling it after the Janet Jackson song, What Have You Done For Me Lately? And in fact, I think an early proposal for the book used that title. My goal in the book was to interrogate whether the Obama administration had or had not represented racial interests in his administration. And I come to the discussion as a scholar of deracialization, or the practice of some Black politicians to attempt to transcend race to appeal to non-Black, mostly white constituents. And they do so by presenting themselves counter-stereotypically, by limiting public appearances in racialized spaces, and by presenting racially non-specific policy platforms. And by racialized, I mean Black. Barack Obama is the most prominent deracialized Black politician to date. So there was legitimate concern about whether Blacks would benefit beyond the symbolism of victory. Scholars have long raised concerns with the practice of deracialization, and note that deracialized politicians, by limiting their engagement with racial issues, hamstring themselves from being effective racial advocates once in office. So they argue that racially fatigued non-Black voters may actually support deracialized Black candidates precisely because they embody descriptive but not substantive representation. And they worry that deracialized politicians risk the loss of their multiracial electoral coalition in the next contest if they take sides in a racial flare-up during their term of office. So with this in mind, I found myself in conversation with other assessments of the Obama administration. The early books on policy barely talked about race at all, or focused solely on race in the context of electoral choice. In particular, they asked whether Obama's race was a help or a hindrance to his electoral chances. When later books started to come out of the Black politics subfield, they tended to engage the topic of deracialization, but they did so through theoretical discussions of symbolic politics or rhetorical discussions, many of which focused on the personal respectability lens through which Obama channeled his deracialization. Most of these arguments were quite critical of the Obama administration and Blacks for not demanding more, noting that African Americans had settled for symbolic politics or for being harangued by a Black president who was trying to please white audiences with his uplift talk. These are all worthy books that I'm honored to be in conversation with. Still, I thought I had something unique to contribute. So what I decided to do was to engage the arguments of my colleagues, but literally count the ways that Obama did engage race, sometimes over the course of his administration and sometimes in comparison with his immediate predecessors. I also wanted to present key indicators of well-being to see if the critics had a point that not much had changed for Blacks under Obama. I do find data to undergird the critiques of some of my colleagues. Inequality has been a hallmark of American life from the founding, and it persisted, often at the same magnitude, throughout the Obama administration. For instance, Black unemployment is usually twice as prevalent as white unemployment. It's been that way for decades. That doesn't change under the Obama administration, even as our economy recovered from the Great Recession. Wealth inequalities did not change. Income inequality did not change. Toward the end of the Obama administration, when home ownership rates had started to tick up among whites and Hispanics, they were at best flat among whites and Hispanics, they were at best flat among Blacks. There are things that do improve for African Americans. The Blacks continued the trend of increasing high school graduation rates and life expectancy. Single incident hate crimes against Blacks went down during the Obama administration. And with the advent of Obamacare, the number of Black and brown uninsured people fell. There are caveats to this though. So life expectancy for Blacks largely plateaued from 2012 to 2015. And while the other three measures marked improvement, the gaps still remain. So whites still lived longer, they were more likely to graduate from high school or to have health insurance. And Blacks were still the biggest target of race-based hate crimes by far. So this begs the question of response. Did the Obama administration try to do anything to address these issues? Were they silent on race or unresponsive to Black interests, as some authors suggested? I argue no. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that every response was successful or that it won the acclaim of scholar activists. But I think it's important and fair to say that I didn't find evidence of complete inactivity. So looking at executive orders and a number of key cabinet departments that were likely to address racial issues, like the Departments of Education, Labor, Justice, and Health and Human Services, I find press releases touting efforts that were targeted to Blacks and other people of color, women, the elderly and poor, the LGBTQ community, etc. So I find that while Obama's executive orders were more racially responsive because he was more likely to make symbolic racial gestures in those executive orders, like creating advisory commissions, and while he sometimes took strategies that proved ineffective, so for instance, the Justice Department removed some Southern counties from pre-clearance requirements under the Voting Rights Act in 2012 because they were trying to prevent the Supreme Court ruling in Shelby County versus Holder the next year. He also didn't outright neglect African-American interest. So for instance, according to PolitiFact and my own quoting, Obama kept 56% of the campaign promises that he made directly or indirectly to African-Americans, a ratio that was in line with the proportion of promises kept to other groups as well. And in the press releases from the Labor Department's enforcement agencies that list victims in employment discrimination, half of those victims were Black, suggesting that the Labor Department was enforcing anti-discrimination laws on behalf of Blacks. Moreover, we have to consider public opinion. I can literally count the number of weeks on my hands where the Gallup approval rating for Obama fell among Blacks below 80%. When I used my own small public opinion samples of Black voters, an all-Democratic sample in 2014 and people of all parties in 2016 to gauge their opinion of Obama, I find that majorities to supermajorities of Blacks reported believing that Obama had met or exceeded their expectations on racial issues. Though the majority of the 2014 sample acknowledged that Black life hadn't changed much under Obama. So why does this matter? In the book, I draw a number of conclusions. In particular, I want to be mindful of the fact that the ways we view the Obama administration in the academy are different than the ways he is viewed in the community. So not everyone is looking at this like they're in a graduate seminar, and we should be mindful of that. Second, it's also important to be honest and to say that while Obama might have done more, he did more than nothing. So what does this have to do with Black Lives Matter and the current protests? I actually think they have a lot to do with Black Lives Matter and the current protest. So I'm very influenced by the now classic work of sociologist Doug McAdam about how social movements emerge. He argues that social movements don't emerge just because people are awakened to inequality and deprivation. Blacks have been aware of their disadvantages since their arrival in America in 1619. And it isn't about being mad as hell and not going to take it anymore, because people have been mad and rightly so for generations. Instead, McAdam argues that social movements emerge when social, political, and economic opportunities emerge that give activists the confidence that they will be able to at least achieve some of their demands. So we can trace the emergence of Black Lives Matter to the hashtag that Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors-Khan, and Opal Tometi created to protest the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the murder of Trayvon Martin. And we saw Black Lives Matter take hold as a social movement after the highly publicized police killings of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. I don't think that this is an accident. So despite the criticisms of Obama, I posit that Black activists were emboldened to ask more of their Black president because the symbolism of a Black president was powerful. We know from the literature on Black mayors in the 1990s that Blacks who experienced Black mayoral leadership reported higher rates of efficacy or confidence in their ability to understand politics and exert influence on the system compared to Blacks who had not yet experienced Black elected leadership at the mayoral level. It is the same type of efficacy that I believe emanated from the Obama era. It gave activists the boldness to challenge the Black president and even the white president who rode the waves of racial grievance into office after him to challenge them to change inequalities that have persisted for generations in America. If there's one thing that we can learn from the recent past and even the current moment, it's this. There is no one elected official who can offer a panacea for centuries of inequality. Leaders can inspire action, but they should be inspiring us to join with them in a partnership to be the change that we want to see. No president can do it alone. Barack Obama couldn't do it, and whether or not he's willing to admit it, Donald Trump couldn't do it alone even if he wanted to. There is no savior in the offing. Once we accept this, though, that should compel us to learn all we can about our system, federalism, and separation of powers, so that we can be strategic in directing our demands to the right officials. And we should learn from this that citizenship requires constant active participation. As voters, first and foremost, especially in the next month. As letter writers, protesters, speakers at community meetings, and general activists in general. So I'll stop there and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thanks so much, Andra. A perfect place to start off from national level policy, and we'll now move to Frank for a more local lens on these issues.
Okay, thanks very much. As was mentioned, my name is Frank Baumgartner and I teach here at the University of North Carolina, and I'm glad to participate tonight. I want to mention a couple things: the extent of disparity, and then the public policy and political response. And so let me talk first about racial disparities. My introduction to criminal justice the study of criminal justice came through a decision to write a book about the death penalty. And I was very interested in how the death penalty was being reframed and transformed in American public opinion and in our public policies by what I called the quote unquote discovery of innocence. The discovery of innocence is ridiculous because the Salem witch trials should have convinced everybody that innocent people can be sentenced to death in America since colonial times. So there should have been no need for any kind of discovery that there could be innocent people on death row. And yet in the 1990s, and particularly in the early 2000s, public opinion became transfixed in the context of the death penalty, transfixed on this idea that, oh my goodness, suddenly we discovered we can't always trust the government always to get things right. There might be mistakes in the area of the death penalty. And that really transformed people's ways of thinking about the death penalty. Well, once you start, so I wrote a book about that, but once you start studying the death penalty or any issue within the field of criminal justice, you can't ignore geography, race, poverty, and general arbitrariness, and gender as well, I should say. So I began to study in greater detail the statistical patterns of the use of the death penalty. The death penalty is really reserved for people who kill, well, the poor people, people with bad attorneys, people with bad economic opportunities to help themselves in their defense, but also particularly people who kill white female victims. The racial and the gender dynamics of the death penalty are so stark that they come out in any study. I'm working on a study right now comparing 1,800 people who faced capital charges in Louisiana and controlling for the severity of the crime and every other thing that we can control for. The black males who had a white female victim face 500% increased odds of the death penalty compared to other demographic groups. So the death penalty itself is a highly symbolic, teeny tiny part of our criminal justice system, but it's the most severe sanction, and it is extremely racialized, extremely gendered, and it has other characteristics that I don't have time to mention. The death penalty, though, is the end of the criminal justice system, its most severe application. The beginning of the criminal justice system is often a traffic stop. It's the most common way that people interact with the police. And I just recently finished a book with some graduate student colleagues on that topic as well. And I could tell you that in general, without getting into too many of the details, black drivers have about twice the odds of being pulled over. And once they're pulled over, they have about twice the odds of being searched as a result of that traffic stop. And police have perfected a methodology that didn't exist until about the 1960s or 70s, which is don't simply racially profile people. First, racially profile them, or profile them based on some kind of appearance or physically apparent cue, which might be the kind of car they drive, might be their race and gender and age. It could be other things such as where they're driving, what neighborhood or what part of the country. But then the key element in policing is to find a legally justifiable reason to pull them over. And once you have that legally justifiable reason to pull them over, you can write a ticket or pull them over for that particular purpose. Well, the magic is, and this was discovered by a deputy sheriff in Florida in the 1970s, there's hundreds of traffic laws and hundreds of vehicle codes. So if you have a shadow extending over your license plate on the back of your car, that's illegal in some states. And it gives a legal justification for the officer to pull you over. And just the speeding laws and the fact that pretty much everybody always speeds whenever they drive a car, and if you're not speeding, you could be pulled over for obstructing traffic, means that anybody who's driving a car is breaking a law. The police routinely ignore all those lawbreakers, but they do have the legal justification to pull over any one of them that they choose. So the police figured out that the traffic code is a magnificent opportunity to engage in informal surveillance of any citizen that they choose. And it's been used systematically since the 1970s as a way to investigate certain people, but not others. Anyway, we found incredible amounts of racial disparity, quite easily predictable by visual cues based on people's demographics. And we also found that we could not make these disparities disappear when we controlled statistically for all the other characteristics of that traffic stop that were made available by whatever state mandated the data collection. And we've studied this in over 1,900 different police jurisdictions. The disparities are huge. And then lately I've been involved in a study of about 8 million arrests in North Carolina, where we also have calculated the odds of being arrested based on where you live and your estimated income, not only your race and gender and age, but also your income and your location. All these things point in the same direction, which is incredible disparities. So I don't want to focus too much on that, other than to say that they are ubiquitous, and I think they're well known. But let me shift to two elements about politics and public policy. The political side of it is, it doesn't apply to people who look like me. The racial disparities put in a position of advantage middle-class white people. Middle-class white people may be quite content with the racial disparities that are in the system because they're unaware of them, and they realize that the police are not targeting people who look like me, so what's the problem? There's no political problem there's no public policy problem for the vast majority of middle-class white Americans. That's the vast majority of middle-class white American voters as well. So the politics of this have been quite interesting. And then the last thing I want to mention is, in 1972, there was one of the worst articles published in political science that I can recall. And it predicted the demise of concern about the environment in 1972. This was just after Earth Day in 1970. And economist Anthony Downs, renowned economist Anthony Downs, published an article called Up and Down with Ecology. And he showed that there was a spike in attention to the issue of the environment. And he predicted that people would tire of the environment and it would slowly fade away, pretty quickly fade away as a political issue. And I'm here to tell you that it did not fade away. Okay, the government is still involved and concerned about issues of environmental regulation. And one of the main reasons for this is that we created, during that period of spike in attention, the Environmental Protection Agency. We passed the Clean Water Act, we passed the Clean Air Act, and lots of things happened in the immediate aftermath of the surge of attention to issues of environmental degradation around 1970. I think that we're in a similar position with racial disparities in criminal justice right now. The issue is, will people be able to take advantage of the sustained and high amounts of attention and the reframing about criminal justice that's happening in the period since Trayvon Martin and has been promoted, as Andra was mentioning, through the Black Lives Matter movement and other groups that are sustaining attention to these issues of racial equity. Will our political leaders then be able to take advantage of this period of sustained attention to leave a residue of important public policy reforms that will cause those changes to be, those disparities to be dramatically reduced? So that's more of a question than a comment, and I hope that that will lead both to our next speaker and also to some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Frank. And over to you, Phillip.
Thanks, Herschel. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Andra. Thanks. There's about 153 of you. I won't thank you all by name, but thank you all for being here. We're now less than a month away from an election that will define the course of the nation. We're sitting at the end of a summer that felt like it was besieged by constant cruelty and plagues, in a year that began with a quarter of the world on fire, escalated to a global pandemic, and then was aggravated by the racial fires that started in Minneapolis and swept the country. So it's a little bit humbling to talk about, well, what specific pieces of research would people want to be hearing about? And I have had the experience, I know there's many academics, or assuming among the participants, I have never had the experience, I should say, of somebody saying, well, a professor spoke for too short a period of time. So I think what I'd like to do is, at the end of all the wonderful contributions that Andra and Frank gave us, kind of sum up a little bit of where my research has been in this moment. I have the unique privilege of being a faculty member in a traditional discipline. My disciplinary background, unlike Andra and Frank, is not in political science, though I sometimes play one in my publications. I'm a social cognitive psychologist. Right? My background is in looking at stereotyping and prejudice and the ways in which they really are bad predictors of discrimination. But I also run a nonprofit. And we work inside of police departments and with activist organizations between the two to try and make law enforcement less deadly and less racist and communities more safe. My goal has always been to translate the research that we do in the laboratory into the world, and then translate the work that we see in the world back into the laboratory for a better understanding that hypothesis testing is not something that gives you a particular p-value. It's something you actually see robustly in the world. So we were amongst the first to popularize the finding, first to popularize the study of implicit bias, which I now have to say, boy, should we not have popularized it with the people we did, because I have to say implicit bias training is a lovely idea. It would be great if anybody actually did it, but we do implicit bias awareness raising in law enforcement. And by the way, not all bias is implicit. We were amongst the first labs to show the age overestimation effect. This is essentially the effect that Black boys first, and then replicated in Georgetown, Black girls as well, are seen as older and therefore less innocent than they actually are. And with new research coming out, it looks as if, benchmarking for arrests even by race and age, that Black children are beaten by law enforcement. They have force used on them by law enforcement at a higher rate than white adults, suggesting that childhood isn't even as protective as whiteness. So we can talk about those issues, but I think I'd rather talk about this moment that we're in right now, where I think it's mostly defined by two competing definitions or diagnoses of the problems of race and policing. There's one diagnosis that says functionally, there's too many errors. There are mistakes that are getting made because of lack of managerial controls, a lack of professionalism, a lack of training, a lack of appropriate accountability mechanisms. And you see this played out by folks who are protesting, who say they want accountability. They'll even say they want justice for someone who is not. I would like to point out often there's no such thing as justice for someone who's been taken off this earth. There's only accountability that's given and possibly peace to those who survive them. But that suggests that the problem is that we shouldn't have these kinds of things that we see, and those things that we see that are outrageous are errors. The solutions then are exactly that: managerial controls, right? Tighter, professionalism, training. But there is another diagnosis that is increasingly ascendant in popular conversations. It used to be very popular in tiny little shops where you can buy coffee, and people thought deep thoughts, occasionally amongst organizers and activists who were not taken nearly as seriously as their intellect should have demanded. But in the mainstream now, we start to see this diagnosis that the 44 officers who've been convicted of violent crimes while on duty since 2005, the only error in the system is that there were as many as 44. That in fact, things are working exactly as they're intended to work. And that's the thing that should inspire change. Now, to that diagnosis, right, there are different solutions than to the first. To the diagnosis that says things are working as they were intended, you have to start reducing the footprint of public safety and law enforcement. You have to start abolishing the mission, because the mission is the problem. I want to point out that these two diagnoses don't have to be in tension, right? It's entirely possible to say that the mission of policing fundamentally needs reimagining and reshaping, and the policing that we have needs to be more professional, and there need to be fewer of the types of errors that lead to death. But while the diagnoses don't need to be in tension, the diagnoses have become identities. People have staked out positions that say, this is the right thing. When people start proclaiming that they have the one right truth, you better start to take cover. They start wearing armbands and things. It goes usually fairly poorly. And what that means is while the diagnoses aren't in tension, the tribes are. And so you have people who have the first diagnosis, the incremental diagnosis, the error diagnosis, who say that the people who want defunding and abolition, right, that's lunacy. They don't live in the adult world. You have people who are calling for defunding and a reimagining of public safety, saying not only are the people who are saying you want to change the managerial controls, not only are they too small in their thinking about this, but they're in the way on purpose. It's malicious. As someone who works inside of law enforcement and alongside the founders of Black Lives Matter, I can't tell you how destructive it is to the process of actually getting things done to have people fighting about whether or not centering Black lives needs to be the issue. In this moment, when we have these competing theories, these competing diagnoses of what to move forward, I think it's going to be incredibly important that we figure out the right way to marry the passions of this moment with the policies that allow us to move forward and not lose ground. Here are the things that actually concern me the most in this moment right now. In the late 1960s, there were huge sparks that led to uprisings across the United States. It wasn't just policing, but policing was the spark, as it always is. It led to conversations about the need for reparations. It led to conversations about the deep oppression and the erasure of Black humanity in cities. At the end of that period, or in the middle of that period, there was an electoral response by the country, and it was Nixon. In 1992, 30 years later, and by the way, we usually do this about every 30 years. In 1992, there was uprisings starting in Los Angeles and that swept across the United States in response to a videotaped document of a motorist, Rodney King, being beaten savagely by what seemed like a gang of LA County Sheriff's deputies. The country was outraged, and for those of you who are historians and who have the kind of hair that I do, you might remember the night of the verdict for the officers was the same night as the last airing of The Cosby Show. And Bill Cosby, who was a different Bill Cosby then than he is now, got out as a scion of respectability and said, don't go to the streets, stay inside and watch The Cosby Show. And Black America said no. And the streets burned, and the federal administration said, we have something we must do. We must meet this moment. And the response was the 1994 crime bill. These are not victories. These are echoes of a circular past, a deja vu that's deadly. And I am very concerned that in this moment, when we're having important conversations about the ways in which incremental reform has been in the way of a more wholesome and fulsome reckoning with the criminal justice and particularly the public safety systems, that in the midst of those healthy conversations, that we're not organized enough to insist upon what should come next, which is different than what's come before. I'm concerned there will be a high-profile incident of some usually young white female that then becomes weaponized as a way to say this moment was all for naught. So we're about to move to the Q&A. I hope that we have plenty of time for that. I hope that that's been a generative element for it, because my concern is if the folks who think seriously about this don't marry that thought with the people who do seriously about this, then in 30 years, we're going to be talking about, and then again in 2020, at the end of possibly all democracy, we did nothing again, and we forgot until the streets were on fire. So again, thank you everybody for inviting me here. This is, it's always wonderful to be with thought-provoking colleagues, and I really do look forward to the questions.
Thanks so much, Philip, Frank, and Andra. Why don't we take a moment to give each of you a few minutes to respond to your colleagues' comments. And in the interim, I will say that in the audience, we have many of my brilliant colleagues who work on related issues. I would encourage them to send questions to the panel, and we will ask you to raise them in a moment. I also see some brilliant students of mine, current and former, who I know think a lot about these issues. So please send over your questions. In the meantime, Andra, Frank, and Philip, please just feel free to respond to one another. Sorry, why don't we?
So I guess I'll start.
Yeah.
Because I unmuted first. Philip, I really appreciated your comments, and I do agree that they're actually very generative and very provocative. I'm thinking about policy and what to do. So I think things that you've mentioned electorally do sort of talk about sort of, in this particular case, the rise or the ascension of Republican elected officials who are in opposition to law and order policy, or in opposition or in favor of law and order policies that would go against the issues and concerns that were being raised by people who are engaging in uprising and protest. You know, that's, I think, an important thing to point out in the middle of an election season. But I'm also thinking about practical things to do with this. So one of the things that I've thought about, and this sounds somewhat of an anathema to many liberal audiences, and I usually try to be very clear when I'm saying this, I'm not anti-union, but like, what about looking at union reform as one way to actually try to get at the problem of police officers who maybe feel that they can do things with impunity? Similarly, I don't know if you're familiar with Rashawn, raised sort of argument about changing the insurance structure for police departments as an extra incentive for leaders in police departments to kind of, you know, hold their officers accountable for, you know, egregious and irresponsible and deadly behavior. So I'll stop there and get your comments.
I think those were literally questions directed at me. Is that right, Andra?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that we're entering into a period of everything and. The most common question I get from reporters at this point is, okay, so what's going to happen next? And I think we read history as if it's a series of inevitable events. We should resist the temptation to read the present moment that way. What's going to happen next is what we insist upon. I think we should be humbled by the patterns of history, but that doesn't mean that we need to be enslaved by them. And so in the context of union reform, yeah, the unions are not always good faith actors in this space. In fact, often they are the worst faith actors in this space. And so the ability to unionize is sort of predicated on the idea of it being a public good. And if unions are acting in bad faith for the public good, with, by the way, the industry that is the only one that is empowered with both the ability to take away liberty and the ability to take away life. Right? The lawyers and the judges, they can take away liberty, right? And the doctors can take away life. Police can do both. And the professional regulations on law enforcement is massively less than the professional ethics standards than it is for lawyers or for doctors. But I wouldn't want us to be fixated on any one solution. I think union reform is absolutely one. I also think that there's a perverse incentive structure in unions, that unions' job is to protect the legal rights of the worst common denominator within law enforcement. You don't ever win for union president by saying, I'm going to protect some of you less vigorously. That doesn't happen, so you end up perversely with this other element. On the issue of individual personal insurance, that's an idea that's actually been around for several decades. And the reason it doesn't get picked up is because who ultimately ends up paying for it, right? It ultimately ends up not being a great tool. So in the small trial areas where it's been trotted out, it ends up not being a great tool for individual accountability. It ends up being a place where the budget for the city goes back in, right? And so you try and set it up so that's not what ends up happening, but you have officers quitting. That seems like it could be a good thing. Or you have officers taking out secondary policies, and you end up having the department having to say, we want this not to go through an individual insurance mandate. Otherwise, we're not gonna be able to field an entire department. So it's, in theory, it makes sense. In practice, it doesn't end up working out that way. And this is the thing that I want for people who are engaged and on fire for this stuff. The ideas are seductive and they're inspiring, and you should dive deep. But don't stop at the ideas. Don't stop at precising and sharpening the logic of the argument. Make sure that you go to the places where the decisions and the power are exercised. Because in those spaces, ideas that seem like they're reasonable at their face don't function. It doesn't mean the idea is bad. It means that the institutions aren't set up to implement them in a functional way. And if we don't know that, we get caught unable to do the translation and missing the moment when change is possible.
I want to ask one more question, sort of to pick your brain as a psychologist. I have a cousin who's a police officer who I think is actually a very steady person and a very thoughtful person. And I've talked to him sort of, as things have happened, and he's given me a really interesting perspective as an insider. I get the sense the way he talks about other people that he knows kind of in the business, that he doesn't view everybody else as being as stable as he is emotionally. That there are people who might be attracted to the job because of the power that goes along with it. And also that there's certainly people who lack a certain cultural fluency that allows them to police effectively in diverse communities. Is there anything that we could do to test for and to monitor these types of elements so that we could flag people who perhaps should not be given the authority to, take away freedom and life?
So it is one of the first questions I get from police chiefs who want to work with my center, the Center for Policing Equity. And they will usually say, how do I get rid of the chuckleheads? Which I don't know how chuckleheads ends up being the term for it, but that's the term for it for many of them. It's harder than it should be, is the long and short of it. Every time we have suggested testing for these issues, we know that what would need to happen is we need to test and then follow people longitudinally to make sure that their on-duty behavior is better predicted by. But it essentially, the concern is it would constitute a negative an employment action if somehow this is selected for, or I worry that I might be selected for this. And ironically, testing people for racial bias, people are concerned that folks will say, well, that's a political designation. And so now you'd be having a public good, right? A public civil service position where politics was part of the selection process. So it's harder than it should be. But I also kind of want to push back on the root of it. So we employ about 25% of the organization at this point is retired law enforcement, right? And they talk much like your cousin talks around this stuff. And that's normal because the most common definition or understanding of racism is that it starts with contaminated hearts and minds, and so we need to get those folks out. But that's not how, I'm not the kind of psychologist that gets people on a couch. I'm not a clinician, I'm a social cognitive person. But what we know of the science is that's not a good predictor of actual discrimination in the world. The better predictors are the situations you put people in, right? I'd much rather have someone who thinks that I am less than human in a situation where people tend to treat people decently than the other way around, right? And so it turns out that the conditions of policing, the conditions of the job, are almost exactly the things that you would do in a laboratory experiment to make somebody act in a discriminatory fashion. And so changing the conditions of policing, literally the mission and the context where police encounter citizens, is likely to be an even better lever on change than the screener for the personnel or trainings or anything like that that reduces to individual character.
This is brilliant. I just want to let Frank jump in briefly, and then I think we might field some of the audience questions we have, because I'm mindful that there are a lot of questions and that folks also have places to run at 6:05. So Frank.
Yeah, thanks. And let me say it's a pleasure to be on a panel with Phil. We haven't met, but I've admired your work for a long time, so it's really nice to hear you in person. I think that, one of the things that Phil mentioned is the possibility basically of backlash. And I think one of the things that's so interesting now is that since, for over 5 years now, we've had sustained attention to issues of racial equity and the overstepping of the 1994 crime bill and, the concerns about racial equity and criminal justice in general. And we've never had, as far as I know, and I do study this kind of thing, we've never had such a long sustained period. There was a period in the late 1990s when many people were talking about so-called driving while black. And then that disappeared in 2001 with 9/11, and racial profiling became, standard in police practice, by the TSA and others. But now we've had many years now, 5 years of sustained attention. So I think one question is that going to lead to solutions that come from the realization that the problem is really severe? Or will it morph into a concern that the problem is worse than any potential solutions? That is to say that, will there be a backlash? Will people say, no, we're going too far now, we're attacking the men in blue, the men and women in blue, and we need to protect the blue? And that is a very serious potential outcome of this. But I think the more likely outcome is that our sustained attention to concerns about racial inequities in criminal justice will lead to some reforms. But so far, I haven't seen real clarity on what would be the best reforms. Abolishing the police, abolishing prisons, is a wonderful statement. But I think there's many reforms that could be quite revolutionary that will go well short of completely abolishing all prisons. There's plenty of crime survivors that really want the perpetrator who raped them or savagely beat them to death or their loved one to death or them almost to death. People do need some kind of punishment. But we don't necessarily need life without parole for 14-year-old boys. And so there's many, many reforms that could be put into place that would revolutionize criminal justice and racial equity in our country that go short of some of the sound bites that are out there. And I could mention a couple. Revise the 13th Amendment to abolish prison slavery. That's pretty simple. Separate out traffic enforcement from police criminal investigations. You don't have to be arrested by a person with a gun and handcuffs because you made an illegal right turn. You just deserve a ticket. Okay, there's many, many things that we could do that would change and transform American policing and criminal justice that fall short of some of the things that have been stated out there in the social movements.
I think I might jump in briefly there because I see a bunch of questions from our students following from Frank's final point. So I see from Colson, from Lismet. Hi, Lismet, welcome back. Sort of precise policy solutions, sort of in the vein of reimagining community policing that people can take and run with, kind of following Frank's final encouragement. So Andra and Phillip, if you both have sort of further ideas in that vein.
Let me add another one. Eliminate peremptory strikes and jury selection. Eliminate qualified immunity for police and absolute immunity for district attorneys and judges. There's some very simple reforms. Not that they're necessarily easy politically, but they would be very clear.
And I'll just note that some of them do actually have support in recent public opinion polling. I think the question when it comes down to what exactly is police reform, what do people mean by defunding or abolishing police, there's actually a lot of heterogeneity of opinion and heterogeneity of preferences. And so it's actually going to take work to actually point towards a particular consensus about what to do. And I think it's important to understand that even within the African-American community, while lots of people have their skepticism of police, It isn't this uniform sort of antipathy towards the police. There's a recognition that they're important and they play an important role in communities. They just don't want to be killed by them. They don't want to be harassed by them. They don't want to have to worry about giving their kids the talk. And so, you know, if there is one failure, I would say, of the Black Lives Matter movement, it is the marketing failure in terms of the term defund the police, because I just think it's sown more confusion. That one has been weaponized, and I think two, doesn't actually get at the heart of what they're trying to do in order to start a really important conversation. That is not to the exclusion of people who actually are in the abolition and reimagining sort of policing, but I think it's important to realize that in a policy discussion, they're going to have to sit at a table with other folks who have different ideas, and people are going to have to hash their ideas out and actually work on trying to be persuasive to one another to try to convince people to come to a consensus about what needs to happen.
So if I might just offer a counterpoint, having worked inside of law enforcement for the past dozen years, to actually get money out of law enforcement budgets and into social services, as we've done to the tunes of we're for several $1 million across the departments where we worked. Our work was limited by what we imagined was politically feasible, and I think it's useful to think about what we imagine is politically feasible. But this moment is limited by what we imagine. And that's not just rhetoric. Here's kind of what I mean. If in early May you had said, "Oh, police abolition is going to be a major theme of public discourse," that would have been lunacy. Because of course that wasn't of course that's not going to be a thing. Defund the police. That's preposterous. And in 2006, if you had told me that I was going to live 8 years under a Black president, I'd be like, "Get the heck out of here." Whose middle name is Hussein? Shut up. And there's going to be a game show host who was going to, you know what? I'm not even going to go there. It's okay to imagine past where we are, because the storytellers and the Imagineers of today are the architects of the future. And it's really, really important to get that. I don't say that as someone who's pie in the sky. We get legislation done, right? Like we move things from point A to point B. And I think that so you talked about a failure of marketing. I think it's a failure of American imagination about how we keep people safe. Frank, you talked about people who've been victims of crime. I'm really inspired by the work of the Alliances for Safety and Justice, especially in California, where they actually ask people who've been victims of violent crime, who by a 15-to-1 margin say they'd rather have the person who committed the violent crime get re-skilled for jobs than go to jail. Because the people who have committed the crimes are from the same communities as the people who are victims of the crimes. And by a 22-to-1 margin, they'd rather have more investment in public education than in punishment. So it is the case that there need to be consequences for violations of the social contract, and no one who is serious is suggesting otherwise. But when we talk about police abolition and prison abolition, the people who are saying cut it all tomorrow are not the architects of that movement. They're not the intellectual forebears of what they're talking about. Is the mission has been from jump to incarcerate, to regulate the movement and the bodies of Black and brown people. And at no point in time did that mission get abolished. Did we say, hey, we founded this when we had property that had names and could learn to read and write? Even if your local law enforcement was not founded under those circumstances, when the laws of this land were explicitly racist, it was law enforcement's job to enforce racist laws. And at no point in time did we say, you know what, my bad, let's start over. Let's make a hard left turn from that. So if we talk about abolition as the abolition of the mission of policing in order to reforge how we interrupt violence in communities that most need it, that's how I talk to police chiefs who say, and I quote from 2 weeks ago, talking to a major police chief from one of the largest cities in the United States, "I'm so very glad that activists have caught up to where we've been for the past 10 decades, or last 2 decades, right? The last 10 years in particular. We ask law enforcement to do too much. We should ask for less. We've disinvested from social services, and we give that all to law enforcement, and then we blame law enforcement when they can't do the things that we've disinvested from. Law enforcement is good at interrupting the potential violence of street crime. They can never be trained to interrupt the violence of poverty. And when we hold them accountable to both, they will always fail. There don't need to, you asked for Herschel and the questions in the Q&A, for specific policy elements. How about first, we have an accounting for where police go so that we can make a decision as a municipality, we don't want them to go there. In fact, instead, we want to stand up social services. So in those moments, there are real, obvious, concrete adult paths forward to do the thing the activists are calling for, that the chiefs have been calling for 2 decades. But there are people who profit off of division and profit off of distraction. I won't name any names, but we know who they are. And they would rather have activists and police chiefs at each other's throats. In fact, activists and other activists at each other's throats than have us organize and say, we insist on a public safety system that actually keeps the most vulnerable among us safe. We're getting close to time. I don't want to keep going on. Sorry.
No, I totally, like, I agree with you, but I think that the bigger point there is the fact that you had to explain it that way suggests that the moniker doesn't quite work. And so I think if we had a marketing professor on this panel, they would have said, come up with another name. And I think that that's actually really important because I'm operating with the assumption that there are a lot of people with low information. So they hear one thing and they take it literally. And so we've got to work on changing that. I think the other important part of this is democracy is supposed to be deliberative. And so I think that what we've just said, there are also people who come from this perspective and talk about this, work through their differences and at least understand what the other person is thinking, we can't actually get to a consensus. And so that's all I'm advocating for.
Let me just follow up with something quickly that follows up on something that Phil mentioned earlier, which is don't be timid. There's many examples in recent American politics and public policy where the unimaginable really has happened. I mean, gay people can get married now. And, you know, it wasn't that long ago that was truly unimaginable. Furthermore, when I was in college, which was a long time ago, but still it's this century, well, it was only the previous century, you could smoke right in the classroom. And you could smoke anywhere in the hospital except for the room where they did surgeries. You could smoke in the emergency room, you could smoke in the pulmonary ward, you could smoke anywhere. And you can't smoke in a public building now. And the tobacco industry was long considered to be the most powerful lobby in American politics, and they had a lockhold on Congress. And so I know that there will be a number of really important political constituencies who will resist change. But we've seen that in the past, and change has happened in some major areas of American public policy. And I think that we're at a moment where there's some real instability in how people are thinking about some really structural issues related to everything about criminal justice. And so I do have some hope that we could see some dramatic changes. And I just hope that we enact good changes rather than bad ones.
Mindful of time, I'm going to follow up on one sort of undercurrent of the last 3 or 4 comments, and then ask a final question sort of directed from the panel to the students on this don't be timid point that all 3 of you have, I think, emphasized, and that I think they could really use hearing a bit more on. So the first substantive question comes from both Lisa Wong and Amy Park. And so Lisa asks, sort of following this point about public opinion and public imagination, why is it that this time with respect to public opinion is different, different than 2016, different than 2013? What are some of the sort of necessary, sufficient, or just probabilistic conditions that has made that possible? And then Amy adds, how can those engaged in this work persuade those not directly affected by these issues to come on board? Or what are the most sort of persuasive components that bring those folks on board? So I'll let you all address those, and then we'll get to a concluding question about not being timid.
As well, I think part of the short answer to the question is, I think the reason why this moment was so visceral was because of the videotape. And I think just seeing that was just so horrifying and shocking that it certainly spurred people to action and to think. The question of the long-term impact, I think, remains to be seen. We've seen some evidence that support for Black Lives Matter tapered off a little bit after sort of the height of the George Floyd protests. So we still have to do more work to see whether or not there's decay and see what are the elements that are going to predict whether or not a person is going to change their attitude and soften their attitudes in support of these particular issues. So I think in terms of sustaining, what I would encourage, administrators to do is to keep these issues at the forefront. So, my school just added a diversity requirement to the undergraduate curriculum. Like, this is the moment to make sure that we're reinforcing this, at least for our students, and then trying to steer people into places where they can actually learn more so that they get knowledge to go along with the feeling.
Yeah, and so if we're all supposed to go, I'm trying to think about why is now different, and how do you keep it up? What she said. Plus, there were a bunch of young organizers who cut their teeth in the aftermath of Ferguson, Freddie Gray, Eric Garner. I don't know how many of y'all, because I can't see anybody here except for the four of us, but how many of y'all remember what it was like in 2014 as Ferguson began to reshape the landscape of political conversations around race? But usually we do this every 30 years, right? Usually it's LA, and before that it's Watts, and then before that it's Chicago, and then it's Chicago again because they're special. They do it a lot. But this time was only 6 years different. And as a result, you had a leadership that was better organized, better networked. They'd done this before. Dedicating yourself to being good at organizing is a craft. It doesn't pay well, but it's a real thing. And that is a big part of the difference. It's part of the reason why I don't tend to criticize the way that activists are making their points. Not because I wouldn't have done it differently. I would rather the rallying cry be invest in Black people, please. But it's because they're activating a base that hasn't been activated before and that can speak authentically to this space. The one thing that I think that gives me hope, Frank kind of mentioned it, I tried to mention it before, what will come next is what we choose. And I think that there are people who are, trying to figure out how to do distance learning and have a college experience who are also like, yeah, but so let's rethink that too. Let's rethink what my 20s are supposed to be like and how dedicated I'm supposed to be to these things that aren't supposed to touch me. But I guarantee you at some point, if we don't get this fixed, this unpaid debt that we've owed to Black people for 400 plus years, that past due note's gonna come due again. And it will always end up hurting the bank account of the folks who owe. So I'm not that worried about bringing people in if they can't see it right now. Time will come.
Frank, do you want to chime in on this?
I think that people have given good answers. Let's go to the next question.
All right, so mindful of time, I really want to hear each of you address the following, which is what general or specific advice you'd give to our students who are invested in, engaged with, concerned with these issues. They are, as you said, in their 20s trying to do distance learning. Meanwhile, so many of them have been engaged with these issues in the spring, in the summer, and continuing now. And I'm just wondering what advice you'd give to all of them.
I can go first since I skipped the last one and let my colleagues think. I would give two kinds of advice, or two pieces of advice that I think are pretty broad. One is learn how to talk to people who disagree with you in a way that is respectful, but also persuasive. That is to say, I think our country suffers from an enormous empathy gap. Middle-class white Americans just don't have empathy for people who are on the other side of the economic divide and the other side of the criminal justice system divide. Some of us are protected by or feel that we're protected by the criminal justice system, and others are targeted by it. And I think we need to cross that empathy gap, and people need to be able to understand what it's like to live on that other side of town. Our communities are incredibly segregated in terms of housing patterns. And so understanding what it's like to live in another neighborhood or in another city with very different characteristics, racial as well as socioeconomic, but in particular with regards to access to public services, access to jobs, and then access to police officers who treat you like a human being. This is very, very different depending on where you live. So I would say let's cross the empathy gap. So do whatever you can do to understand that and try to cross it. The other thing is, to young people, I would say don't treat it as a side job. Make it your career. Find a way to get into a career path where you're doing more good than harm. Don't be an investment banker. That's not going to help. Don't go become a billionaire and say that you're going to give off some money as a philanthropist after you make your first $1 billion. Just go do something decent from the very first beginning. You don't have to wait until after you do a lot of other things. So build your career into, build social justice into your career.
So I guess, my simple answer right now is political participation takes on many forms. And so it's important that you engage all of them. So in particular, right now, vote. So if you don't see the importance of voting, I think Phillip's historical narrative is a really important thing, right? People who were hostile towards the interests of justice and policing get elected sometimes after uprisings, right? Because people are complacent or because they're being prevented from voting. So you need to sort of fight against that and make sure that your voice is being heard. The other thing is that you have to engage in different types of strategies. So you need insiders and you need outsiders, and some of you are going to end up playing that dual role, and you should feel comfortable embracing that, right? So yeah, so you can't just specialize in one thing, as important as that is, especially if it doesn't involve voting, and expect that you're actually going to be able to do a complete job. So feel free and understand that citizenship is a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour-a-day commitment.
All right, so let me do two because I'm mindful of time. I'll try and keep them quick. The first one is strap in. You care about this? We're not getting to the place that you want us to get to, except through a pile of dead bodies. I don't use that as a rhetorical device. That's real. There will be another and another and another and another. And if you aren't ready for the ones that don't make the headlines, you're a tourist. And it's okay to be a tourist in a place where it's important to do the work, right? You show up, you do it for a little while, you go home. But if you really want to make a difference in this space, strap in. I've been doing this since I had hair and could see my belt buckle. It's a long time, right? I haven't seen nearly the kind of change that I want to see, but it's a long-term commitment. And whether or not you make it a career, if you make it part of your passions in life, strap in. You know, Andra made reference to the great Doug McAdams earlier in terms of social movements. Folks who participate in things like AmeriCorps and Peace Corps are no more likely to be participating in social uplift and social good programs 10 years later than the folks who did nothing. That's because this stuff is hard. Become emotionally prepared. Strap in. Second thing, and with that, don't look away. There'll be lots of reasons for distraction, lots of times where this won't make the headlines. But the other part is learn how power works. Right? Political science is supposed to be the science of understanding politics, which is about polity, but really it's supposed to be about power. But so often the people who care most about this, they're allergic to the dirtiness of how it lives in the world. And I understand that because it's dirty. I take a shower at the end of every day just from the conversations I've had to manage. But if you don't understand how power works, you won't have any concept of how to translate those ideas into policy that lives protecting people. So make that part of your educational goals. And you won't do that just in a classroom, right? You understand how classroom power works. There's somebody who's got the syllabus and the power to grade you. But how does power actually work? It doesn't just work in elected office. It's not just the person at the top. Who's the one who makes the decision, right? And I'll give an example of this. I was talking with a friend who regularly gets a chance to go to see the Super Bowl, right? And he's not one of the people who's got like a ticket and he's like on the list of I've been to every. He regularly gets to go and see the Super Bowl. And he doesn't try and get to know Tom Brady because nobody wants to do that. Doesn't try and get to know the owner, Robert Kraft, because at the Super Bowl, they've got their tickets and those are already going out to their folks. They know the security guards. And they know the people working the law enforcement detail. It's the MFK, the MFer with the key. Because in that situation, power works solely by the person who has the key to the gate you need opened. Learn how that works in the spaces you care most about. You will be much more effective for the things you care about.
And with a final argument encouraging everyone to take more political science classes and focus on street level bureaucrats, let me tremendously and sincerely thank our phenomenal panel. This has been brilliant. Thanks so much for all of you sharing your expertise and time, and I will turn it back over to my colleague, Joanne.
Well, I echo everything Herschel just said. That was inspiring, thought-provoking. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions. There were a lot of good questions still left to be answered. Thank you so much to our panel for giving not only your time, but a little bit of extra time. Thank you to Herschel for moderating and Jason for introducing. I want to thank everybody who attended today. We hope you'll join us for next week's event, which is our Dreyfus lecture. It's entitled Race Against Time, The Politics of Darkening America, and it will be given by author and CNN commentator and member of the class of 1987, Keith Boykin. We hope to see you there. Thank you so much to everyone. It was a great event. Thank you.